So, professional learning communities in education, I think, are one of the most misused topics that we have out there in education. So, there are a lot of words that get thrown around that people use, but they don't necessarily mean that we're doing them in the correct way. And I think that professional learning communities is one of those. Um, Professional learning communities came about quite a few years ago as kind of a product of there was a high school that was low performing. Um, at the time, the administrators there were the DeFores, which some of you all may have heard of those, Rick and Becky DeFore. And as they started working with, started thinking about how can we turn around our high school students and increase their success rate, increase their graduation rate, increase their knowledge rate, increase ACT, increase college admissions, increase post-secondary success in life, all of those things, career readiness, college readiness. They started realizing that they could use their time during their school day more efficiently and more effectively. And also, they noticed that they were not necessarily having conversations around the right things. So, people were the things that people were focusing on, and by people, I mean the adults in the building. The things that the adults in the building were focusing on for students were not necessarily the things that were actually going to move the students forward. And so, as part of their work, they really kind of hit upon this concept that they ended up coining as professional learning communities. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it's not. As professional learning communities started becoming popular, and we started hearing that language more and more out there, and they started sharing the work that was going on, people picked up on that language without fully understanding everything that went behind it. And so, unfortunately, what started happening is we, in some cases, not all, definitely not all, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but in a lot of cases, as people started getting on the PLC or the professional learning community bandwagon, what started happening was we didn't really change what we were doing during our meetings. We just changed what our meetings were called. So in a lot of places, we would say, oh, well, instead of a department meeting, we're now calling this a professional learning community. But we didn't really change what we were talking about in our department meeting to really be what a professional learning community was supposed to be. Or instead of a team meeting or instead of a faculty meeting, we're now going to call this a PLC. We're now going to call this a professional learning community. But what was happening there really wasn't a professional learning community. So I will say this, in schools, actually in any profession, but in schools specifically, there are lots of different types of meetings that have to happen. We don't always like meetings, but as we collaborate and as we work together to improve and take student achievement to higher levels, there are some things that we have to meet about. And some of those meetings are purely informational in nature. And those are necessary meetings. We do have to have meetings where we are informed about dates and deadlines and due dates and different things going on. We've got to have that information. But those are just informational meetings. Those are not professional learning communities. We also have other meetings where we have to figure out what's going on with the field trip, and we have to figure out what's going on with the fundraiser, and we have to do those different types of things. And those are important meetings to have, but those are not necessarily professional learning communities. And so we have to kind of think about the language that we're using in our schools to reflect and to make intentional what it is that people are doing. So if professional learning communities aren't informational meetings and aren't planning logistics meetings like field trips and fundraisers and different things like that, then what is a professional learning community? And so the DeFores actually said that, actually when they were working on this work, they said that when we have our professional learning community meetings, we're going to work as a professional learning community to answer these 4 questions about our kids. And the first of those questions is, what do we want our students to know and be able to do? The second question is, how will we know when they get it? The third question is, what are we going to do when they don't get it? And the fourth question is, what are we going to do when they do get it? And so when I think about those 4 things, that is actually what makes up a professional learning community. So if you are in a meeting that is intentionally focused around these 4 questions, then what you're participating in is a professional learning community. But if your meeting is focused on anything other than these 4 questions, then what you're in is not a professional learning community, and that's okay, but don't call it a PLC. Don't call it a PLC. So when we think about these 4 questions, tonight we're specifically going to focus on what I think of as academic professional learning communities, but really um, these questions could be used for things other than academics. For example, behavior. A lot of times schools have what they call behavior PLCs, where there is a group of people that work on the behavior systems for the school. And if you think about these through the lens of behavior, these 4 questions also apply. What do we want our students to know and be able to do with their behavior? How will we know when they get it with their behavior? What will we do when they don't get it with their behavior? And what will we do when they do get the behavior? So these questions can have some different things. I also know some schools that focus on attendance PLCs, and they're specifically thinking about what do we want our students to know and be able to do in terms of their attendance. How will we know when they get it in terms of their attendance? So as long as you're focusing around these 4 questions, they don't necessarily have to be academic. And by academic, I mean content and standards based in nature. However, for our purposes tonight, what we're going to do when we talk about PLCs is we're going to talk about the academic PLCs that are going on in the building, that focus around these 4 questions. So these 4 questions are the crux of any PLC. If you're not talking about these 4 questions, then what you're in is not a PLC, and it's a different kind of meeting. So just call it that. Whatever kind of meeting it happens to be, you just call it that. So there are lots of different structures to go about organizing the conversation so that it is productive around these 4 questions. You have some people that you could throw these 4 questions at, and they could be quite efficient and productive and take it and run with it. In most cases, we need a bit more structure to ensure that this conversation stays on track, stays on focus, and stays targeted to the questions at hand. And so that's where I am going to introduce a structure known as PDSA. Now, that's the vehicle that we're going to use tonight to talk about one way to organize and structure PLC meetings around these 4 questions. If your school has functioning PLCs and does not use the PDSA model and uses something else, that doesn't mean it's wrong. PDSA is not the only way to run a PLC meeting. However, PDSA is a structure that has been proven to work in turnaround schools, as well as different types of businesses and organizations, and have proven to have high rates of success. So PDSA, that's why that's the model that I am presenting to you tonight, because there's a lot of evidence and research behind the PDSA model as one of the most effective structures to skyrocket student achievement levels. We have a lot of schools here in the state of Kentucky, and some of you all might be in one of those that have participated in turnaround and hub school models where they utilize the PDSA structure and have a lot of successful results as a part of that. But again, it's not the only way to operate it. So what does PDSA mean? PDSA is actually a problem-solving model that stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. And so basically, when we think about this model, it is a problem-solving model that allows you to think about and tackle the problems and the barriers surrounding student achievement in a productive and efficient way. And so there are 4 cycles or 4 phases, I guess, for lack of a better word. So there's 4 phases to the PDSA model. And so when you think about how we go about our meetings, what the purpose of PDSA does is it helps to bring a structure and a focus to what is going on in the meetings so that everyone stays on task and on target, because time is always the essence, right? It also helps to think about what the problem-solving model needs to look like. So obviously, when we talk about student achievement, there are always barriers and problems around student achievement. The only time that there's not barriers or problems around student achievement is when 100% of our students are graduating, having mastered all of the standards that we put before them at the highest level. And I don't know, even in the highest achieving schools across the country, where that's happening with 100% of kids. So what PDSA is it's a structure to help guide us to higher and higher levels so that we can continually grow. Now, I will say this, the Plan, Do, Study, Act model was not invented for education. Plan, Do, Study, Act is a problem-solving model that's actually used in hospitals, businesses, factories, small and large businesses, different organizations, um, as a way of trying to develop solutions to barriers or problems that were going on with the organization. And somewhere along the line, somebody in education picked it up and had the idea of, hey, I think this actually would work well with education or with schools. And so let's try it. And they found out that it had extremely high levels of results in education, as well as it does in all of these other businesses and industries and the medical profession as well. So it's a multi-purpose model, and it works for any type of problem solving that you're trying to find solutions for. So that said, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through briefly tonight each of the 4 phases of PDSA and what that might look like in a school where teachers are meeting in these small groups to talk about student achievement and how they're going to improve student achievement around those four questions that we talked about. So that said, before we get into what each of the phases look like, let's think about what the makeup and um, thoughts that we need to have, intentional thoughts that we need to have about our professional learning communities in our schools. So as a leader of a school, one of the things that you're going to have to determine is who makes up each of my PLCs. And some of that depends on the purpose of the PLC. So if we're talking about academic PLCs for our purposes tonight, um, then what I'm going to be looking at is I'm going to be looking at who makes the most logical sense to get together and talk about, have common conversations around student achievement. And in most cases, depending on the size of your building, depending on how many people you have, in most cases, that makes sense to do in either grade levels, teams, or departments. All right, so it kind of depends on the makeup of your school. In most schools, what they do in elementary schools is they organize those around grade levels. So you might have a first grade PLC because in elementary schools, most first grade teachers teach the same things, right? So now they have multiple subject areas, but they share common standards. They each teach the same things, and so it makes sense to have them coming together as a group. When I start moving up to high school, things look a little different because I can't just have a 10th grade PLC because in 10th grade, everybody's departmentalized for the most part, right? So in that case, it makes more sense at the middle and high school levels often to departmentalize the PLC. So I might have a math PLC. I might break it down even further and have a 7th grade math PLC. I might have a 10th grade Algebra 1 and 2 PLC because most of my algebra teachers teach both Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, depending on the size of my building. I might have, or it might not even be 10th grade, it might just be Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 PLC because there might be students at multiple grade levels in those. I might have a geometry PLC. I might have an English 1 and 2 PLC. So it kind of depends on where you are. Now, if you're in smaller buildings where maybe you only have one person teaching a grade level, then you probably want to expand your group a little bit because you don't want a PLC of just one person, right? So you kind of have to think about the makeup of your building. The other thing that you want to think about are the frequency of your professional learning community meetings. So if I go back to these 4 questions, you got to think about who makes the most sense to get together and talk about those 4 questions, and how frequently is that group going to need to meet in order to do a good job of talking about those questions. Now, some of the frequency is going to make a little more, or you'll have more ideas about the frequency of the meetings as we get through the Plan, Do, Study, Act model, and you'll see the time that it's going to take and the follow-up that needs to happen as part of that. But in general, the general rule of thumb is that at most schools have PLC meetings about every 2 weeks. You're going to see some schools that meet more frequently than that. For example, one of my schools meets every single week. They PLC every single week. And that's okay. Most schools try to do every other week, and you'll kind of see why as we work through PDSA. The minimum recommendation for frequency of PLC meetings is at least once a month. Um, most people who meet just once a month find that they need to meet for longer periods of time, just to be able to get through everything. And most people who are on once a month PLC meetings usually say that they feel a little bit rushed and that it's not quite enough time. So meeting once a month is better than not meeting at all in PLCs. But ideally, what you probably need to try to shoot for as you're planning the structure is every other week. In terms of that. So, but you just kind of have to build that based on how frequently can our people get together and how do I work that. The next thing to think about, which is related to frequency and makeup of your teams, is building in time for a common meeting schedule. If you just tell your teachers, I expect you to meet in these PLCs, but you don't have any common time to meet together, and I'm not creating any common time for you to meet together, yet I expect you to meet together to work around this, then what's happening is people are floundering and they also become very disillusioned and they become resentful of the process because no one is providing them the time. They're having to take extra time out of time that nobody has anyway to try to figure out how to get together and how to meet. And what we don't want people to do is to see this as a burden or something that they become resentful of. So what we have to do when we design our structures and our meeting schedules is we have to think about how do I design a master schedule and a meeting schedule that will allow the people that are on my PLCs to have common time to plan together. Now, obviously, the best way to do that is to embed time within the day for people to have common planning time. And so, at elementary, middle schools, and even most high schools, there is some common planning time. And if the teachers that are together have common planning time, and again, if you know ahead of time that my Algebra 1 and my Algebra 2 teachers need to have common planning time, then as I go into designing my master schedule, I can think about designing a schedule to allow them to have the same class period off as they're planning so that then they can get together during that time. Most of the time that's doable if you think about it up front and are intentional about how you design your school's master schedule. But sometimes it's not always possible, especially as you get up into the higher grades and you have a lot of people that are teaching singleton classes and things like that. So if there's not an option for common planning time, then what you have to do is you have to start thinking about how am I going to build my meeting schedule such that I embed opportunities for people to do PLCs. And so where a lot of schools do that is around their common faculty meeting time. And so let's say that we have faculty meetings once a week. Some people think that's a lot. I don't. When I was a principal, we met once a week. Every Monday was, I think it was Monday. Every Monday was every Monday afternoon was our faculty meeting date. Everybody was expected to be there on Mondays. And we had a schedule such that one Monday a week was committee meetings, like site-based council committee meetings. One Monday a month was informational faculty meeting. One day a month was student work analysis. And then one meeting a month was something else. But anyway, if you have a schedule like that, then what you could do is build in, okay, one Monday a month is our PLC or 2 Mondays a month or whatever that looks like. Like everybody's expected to be there, but these are going to be our PLC times. So you can work it in terms of after school, or if you're a school that starts later, you could work in some before school meeting expectation times. So there are different things to think about in terms of how you're going to develop that common meeting schedule, but it is an important part of designing PLC. The other thing that you want to make sure that you have is a focused agenda, and PDSA provides an agenda structure for that, and I'll share some ideas with you about that as we continue through the process tonight. And then also you really want somebody that is strong in understanding PDSA and that can facilitate the meeting. And so we'll follow back up with that a little bit, but sometimes that's the administrator, but the administrator can't always be at every single PLC. So it's a good idea to train up some teacher leaders, some department chairs, some instructional coaches, depending on who you have in your building, who can facilitate the PLC themselves. So that said, I mentioned agenda. This document is in your content folder for this week. And I'm just sharing this with you guys as an example. When we went through PDSA training with our district, we worked with teacher leaders and school administrators, and we studied each phase of PDSA. We spent, actually, overall, we probably spent about 18 months to 2 years just learning about PDSA. And we did the whole structure, and then we went back and dug deeper with each phase. But as we went through the whole structure and started digging deeper, what the teacher leaders and the facilitators and the administrators said was, it would be really great if we had all of the things that we talked about, like on a one pager, just that we could keep in front of us and remind ourselves as we go through our meetings so that we're not forgetting. And that's kind of where this document came from. So it's just something we compiled based on the different things. And so you can see it's a reminder about what each phase is and what the goal of each phase is. And then there's a checklist, which you don't really want to reduce things just to a checklist for compliance. But these are reminders about the things that you should be talking about in your PLC um, when you're in that particular phase. And so again, just some checklist reminders. And then we also added a column for resources because we found that the resources were helpful. So as we were studying each phase, what resources could we pull in to help us, give us some places to go and pull ideas from. And so that's where that is. A lot of our schools actually just use this as their agenda. And so they have this in front of them. This is their agenda. They just check it off as they go. And it's a good reference tool to have as they go through the process. So let's think about what each step in the process looks like. So if we're thinking about plan, do, study, act, the plan phase is really the first phase in the process, and it's the phase where we're thinking about what do we want our students to know and be able to do. So it goes back to that first to four question of what do we want them to know, what do we want them to be able to do in terms of their learning. And so, what we're thinking about in the plan phase is to identify those standards and targets that we're going to be mastered during this module. So, when I think about the plan phase, what I have to do is I have to go back and think about how frequently are my PLCs meeting. And so, let's just say that we're going with the standard once every 2 weeks. All right. So the number of standards or targets that you're talking about means for the upcoming cycle. So until we meet again, so 2 weeks from now, over the next 2 weeks, what standards and targets are we working on that we expect students to master during this upcoming cycle, 2 week cycle? Right. So now, if your PLCs are longer than that, if you only meet once a month, then what you're doing is you're talking about the standards and the targets to be mastered over the next month until we meet again. If you're on 1 week cycles, then you're only talking about what are we looking at over the next week. Right. So what you're talking about here depends on the frequency of your cycles and how frequently your PLCs are meeting. But you're going to identify the standards and the targets. You're going to make sure that everybody understands the meaning of each target and that you're thinking about that and that everybody's on the same page. So if the target uses the word theme, then we want to make sure that we all have the same idea of what theme means. And we also want to make sure that we have the same idea about how far that target's going, right? We also need to discuss essential vocabulary that's coming up in the next 2 week cycle. So what are the main vocabulary words that students need to know and be able to use during the next couple of weeks or during that? And then identifying what this is going to look like in the classroom and then thinking about how I'm going to assess that. So that's the planning phase. This is just a way to kind of put it all together concisely. So during the planning phase, what your group is doing is you're talking about, all right, let's think about what's coming up over the next 2 weeks. What targets are we working on? Which standards are we working on? What's the vocabulary? How far are we going with it? How are we going to formatively assess it? And depending on where you are in the learning cycle, you may or may not be ready for a summative assessment. So if you're towards the end of the learning cycle, meaning the end of a unit, you might be about ready to give a summative test, and in which case you need to review the summatives and make sure that what you've done so far has got students ready for that point. With the formatives, you're just kind of talking about, okay, along the way, we might not give the same formative assessments every single day that are exactly the same, but we need to have a few common formative assessments along the way, 2 or 3 over the next couple of weeks, so that we can come back and compare student performance results. All right. So those are the conversations that are happening during the plan phase. Now, I usually get asked, how long does that take? Because depending on certain groups, some people could take 3 hours just to talk about that stuff, right? And so my response to that is always, most groups that I'm in, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes, 10 minutes to 15 minutes. And some people are like, how do you get that done that fast? Well, what I would say is that if you have put the work into developing your guaranteed and viable curriculum, you've already identified these things. So, what I would say is that until you have gone through a process of determining your essential standards, which remember we talked about that with guaranteed and viable curriculum, and both Marzano and Buffum in your books have talked about the importance of having that piece established. So, what's already happened, usually over the summer, is that we've made sure our standards are lined up and that we've made sure that our targets for each unit, so are scaffolded for each standard and each unit are kind of organized. So I've got my units and my pacing guides organized. I know what standards and targets go together in different units. I know what targets go with which standards, and I kind of know my essential vocabulary for the unit. So that work's already been done up front. If that work hasn't been done, really honestly, before you jump right into Plan, Do, Study, Act, what I would recommend is investing your time into doing that work first. So coming to agreement on what are our essential standards, what are our targets. But once you have that done, you have that there. That's your guaranteed and viable curriculum. It's already developed. It's sitting there. So your group has already had some conversations around it prior to this. Now you're just pulling them back out and saying, okay, so let's revisit what we said was going to be happening in this unit during the next upcoming 2 weeks. These are the standards. Here's the targets. Let's look over those targets. Are we on the same page with those? Let's look over our vocabulary. Okay, so if we're good with that, how are we formatively assessing those? Do we have a few formative assessments that we can do along the way over the next 2 weeks? Which ones are we really gonna be our major ones? And then you're ready to move on to the do phase. All right. So when you have your guaranteed and viable curriculum in place, or at least mostly developed, it doesn't have to be perfect. But once that piece is there, then this plan discussion really doesn't take very long because you're just revisiting. So a lot of groups can do that in 10 minutes. Some groups take about 15, especially if they're really talking about the formatives and those aren't fleshed out. Okay. All right. Oh, I'll talk about that one in a minute. Okay, I'll come back around to that one and talk about it. All right, so once you're good with that, then you're ready to move into the do phase. And so the do phase is thinking about how am I going to make sure that students learn this? So plan phase is, what do I want them to learn? What do I want them to know and be able to do? The do phase is, how am I going to get that information across to them? How am I going to make sure that they learn it? All right. So if I'm thinking about how am I going to make sure that they learn it, what I'm doing at this point is I am talking about the high yield strategies or the evidence-based strategies that are going to move them forward in their work. And so this is the part that I feel like most teachers are pretty comfortable with for the most part, because this is really where you're talking about your activities. What are we going to do during these lessons to help students master these particular learning targets and these particular standards that we've set aside for them? So what we have to be careful about, though, is that we're not just talking about any random activities just because they're fun. What we have to do is we have to make sure that we're incorporating those evidence-based high yield strategies. So as we start talking about our activities, we have to first of all, say, are these activities congruent with our learning targets that are also going to move students toward those scaffolded steps to mastery of the standard, right? And so, are these the best, most efficient activities that I can do with kids to move them forward? Or are there better, more efficient, research based, evidence based, high yield strategies that might actually be better? And so, notice at the bottom of the screen, we've got the visual of spoon and shovel. And this has just become kind of the visual in our district about what's a high yield strategy. Always think in your mind, spoon or shovel. And so what that means is that if I'm digging a hole, I can dig the hole with a spoon or I can dig the hole with a shovel, right? And if I hand each of those to somebody and say, pick your tool to dig the hole, Well, obviously we should pick the shovel, right? However, if you're shuffling around in your bag, in your little toolbox, and all you have is a spoon, and I tell you to dig a hole, well, it's better than digging with your hands, right? Sometimes you might throw the spoon away and use your hands, but it's not very efficient, right? Eventually, you'll get the hole dug, but it's going to take you a lot longer. You're going to get really dirty while you're doing it, and you're going to get really frustrated, right? And it's going to take forever. Whereas a shovel is much faster, more efficient, and cleaner than a spoon. And so I want you to think about your instructional strategies the same way. Your high yield, research based, evidence based strategies are those shovel strategies. They're more efficient, they're more effective, and they're better for kids and they're better for teachers. So they're going to get you where you want to be faster, and they're going to get you where you want to be with less frustration. And they're more efficient overall. So this piece kind of harkens back to the reason why I wanted you all researching and knowing like where to find the high yield strategies and the research-based and evidence-based practices that will move kids forward, because this is where you pull those in. So this is where you start thinking about and talking about, okay, when we teach this particular learning target, what activities are we going to use? Now, are those the best activities? And then after you've done this for a couple of years, or people that have been around, you can say, all right, when we did this last year, how did this go? Did kids respond well to this strategy? Do I need to incorporate a different strategy because kids really struggled with it? Let's go to our strategy bank. So it's really important in this phase that teachers, at least some teachers, have a good toolbox of resources that you can pull from. Because if the toolbox isn't very full, then people are going to reach in and only be able to pull out spoons, right? So part of the work over time has to be building up toolboxes of the best strategies that you can find. That's part of the reason why I had you guys work so hard on those at-risk population presentations, because it's not just about at-risk populations, it's about all populations. What are the best strategies that are out there, and how do you present them to teachers? Because over time, you're going to have to be presenting to teachers and getting them to try new, different, deeper, more efficient, more effective strategies as we get those from the research. And so that's where this comes into play. The more that you can do that with teachers and fill their toolboxes, then when they get into this phase of planning, they're going to have a whole arsenal of tools to pull from, and they're going to be able to pull the best ones out. Whereas if I just have a few tools, I'm just going to be pulling out the tools that I have, whether they're the best ones or not. All right. So that's really the do phase. And teachers actually do pretty good with this because they come with ideas and activities that they've either done in the past or that they've heard or that they've tried of. But you have to look at those through the lens of, are these the best ones to move students forward in terms of their learning? All right. So again, this is just kind of a way to look at it. So your goal in the do phase is that your group in the PLC is identifying and discussing strategies that best fit in the context of the learning, not just any strategy, not just any activity, but is this the best activity and the best strategy to move kids learning forward with this? So you'll kind of discuss and talk about the strategy. You'll talk about those congruent classroom activities. How do you execute those? And then thinking about the rigor level of the activities, and is it going to actually move students to mastery and to congruency, right? And then what you see on the bottom right of your screen is just an example of also how to move vocabulary forward. And so six Marzano steps is actually a high yield strategy for teaching vocabulary, as opposed to a spoon strategy, which might be copy down the definition out of the dictionary and write the word in a sentence. So if I need to work on vocabulary with the students, that would be a spoon strategy, or I could replace that spoon strategy of writing the word in a sentence with a strategy from Marzano's 6 steps, which is a proven high yield evidence-based strategy. But if your teachers don't know that Marzano's 6 steps or other vocabulary strategies are out there, they're not going to be using the most efficient strategies. We have to make sure that they have those again. So again, the idea of this is why that we work on those at-risk populations presentations, because we have to be able to present and get that information across to teachers. All right, so I'll kind of pause right there and say that usually what happens in PLCs is that teachers do the plan and the do phase together because they kind of make sense. What do I want my students to learn, and how am I going to get them to learn it, right? The study phase is when you come back and you actually look at how students did based on the activities and the strategies that we used with them. And then we formatively assess them throughout the way. When I come back for the study phase, that's where I'm actually looking to see how did students do. So obviously, if I'm in plan and then do, I can't just automatically move into study because at this point I don't have any data to study, right? I've got to plan it, I've got to do it. Then I've actually got to go out and do it with my kids and formatively assess along the way so that I can have that formative assessment information to bring back to actually study, or summative assessment information, depending on where you are in the cycle of learning and the cycle of assessment. So different PLCs handle this different ways. Some of them come together and so this is where I say that a lot of times, sometimes people meet weekly, because sometimes what they do is they come together and they say, okay, this is our plan and do week. This is our study and act week. Some people decide to do, I'm going to do 2 or 3 cycles of plan do. So I'm going to plan do, collect some data. We're going to plan do again, collect a little more data, and then I'm going to come together and study some data. Some people decide to start their meeting, instead of starting with the plan phase, they start with the study phase because everybody has just come from teaching something, right? So I'm going to come and bring that information. We're going to study it. We're going to develop our ACT plan, and then we're going to plan and do. So you can kind of decide in the cycle how you want to organize it and in what order you want to go with. And some of that's going to depend on how frequently you're meeting, how often you're gathering data, what kinds of data you're gathering to study. But I want to say that because there's not a right or wrong way to do this. It just kind of depends on the structure that you all decide. But the idea is that you're doing all 4 of the phases. So what happens during the study phase? Once you've taught information to the kids and you've gathered data through formative and or summative measures, then you come together as a PLC group and you study the data. So during the study phase, we're figuring out how well did they learn it? And then I'm thinking about what do I do when they didn't learn it? And what do I do when they did learn it? And so that's kind of where you are with study. But first, I have to just look at the data and figure out how well did they master the information that we taught them and how well did our strategies work. So there are 4 basic questions that often happen during the study phase that are data-wise questions. And they're just questions like, what does the data tell us? So as we're looking at our formative assessment data, I need to think about what's it tell us. So the in the phase data tells us that a certain percentage of students mastered it and a certain percentage of students didn't. The data also, if we dig into it, will tell us what the student misconceptions are if we're looking at the student work, and different things like that. There's also a place where we look at what does the data not tell us. And so that's an important part of the conversation, because what the data might not tell us is that, well, my kids really bombed this formative assessment, but throughout that week, I had 5 different kids that were out with the flu, and on any given day, I only had about 80% of my class. So I was doing a lot of catching up, and some kids were behind, and so each day I was doing that. Well, that's important information to have, right? The data might not tell us that we had a fire drill right in the middle of class and I had to leave and then kids got behind and so we just didn't get as far as I thought we were going to get, right? That's data that sometimes might be helpful. It's also important to talk about causes for celebration. Oftentimes in teaching, we want to go straight to what's wrong, what's the bad stuff. And it's really important to force, and I do say force because sometimes it's hard to get people to talk about the good. I don't know why that is, but it just is. So really stopping and answering that question, what is good? What is our data showing us that is cause to celebrate? And there's always some good in every data. And so really kind of teasing that out and thinking about why is that good? And then the other question obviously is what are the opportunities for improvement based on the data that we have? So during the PLC discussion, it is important that each member shares individually kind of their overall class results and really thinking about the root cause and the misconceptions of some of those. And so there's different ways. So how do we individually share class results? So there's some different ways that we can do that. This is one way that you can come together and talk about your class results. So, if this should look familiar to you, if you'll think back to like week 2, when you guys did your formative assessment student work analysis, there was a reason for that. This sorting protocol is one way that you can have people come prepared to talk about their study. All right. So if you ask people to come, we're going to have our study meeting, our study and act meeting. If you come prepared with your student um, performances sorted based on the wow, got it, not yet protocol. And then you can have some conversations around which students got it, which students didn't get it, which students got it great. And overall, as a group, do we see any common misconceptions or errors? And this generates some really good conversations among teachers because you can have the conversation around, wow, look, all of our kids that didn't get it had this misconception. Now, that has lots of implications, right? If we're finding a really common misconception that's happening throughout, then what we need to ask ourselves is, okay, is something that we did in our activities unintentionally lending to that misconception? And or is there something that we missed, or is there an activity or a strategy that we could use that would address that misconception? So at this point, you're at a reteach area. Like, I need to go back and fix that misconception for these students that didn't get it. But thinking ahead to when we do this again, because you'll teach it again next year, right? Thinking ahead to when we teach this again, knowing that this is a common misconception, we need to make sure when we design our unit next time that we put some things up front to try to maybe alleviate that misconception from the front end so that we don't have to try to go back and reteach it on the back end, right? So the conversation is kind of twofold. The conversation is about what can we do right now for this group of kids to remediate that misconception, but also what can we do in the future to make sure that that misconception is not a misconception at all? Is there something that we can do better? So you're really reflecting on your practice, the activities and the strategies that you're using. The other way that this conversation can change during a PLC is you might say that, wow, you know what? 90% of your kids got it, were either wow or got it, and only 10% of your kids were at not yet. But for my kids, I only had 50% of my kids in the wow and not got and got it, and I had 50% of my kids in the not yet. So you did something that I didn't do. What was that? And so actually having some conversations around um, um, why that might be, and so learning from each other, because you're going to have some people in there that are going to have some better success than you. And there may be reasons, rational reasons for that, but it could be that they even though everybody was kind of talking about similar strategies, it could have been that they tried something that you didn't, or did something just a little differently, or explained something a little differently that might help your kids. And so it's kind of learning from each other. So that's one thing that can happen during the study phase. There are different ways that you can do a data analysis, but this is one way to look at that. Um, Another thing to think about in tracking that sometimes people use is some sort of a tracking chart. And so this is an example of what a tracking chart could look like. And I've seen some teachers and some PLCs that do this for every single kid that they have. If I'm a high school teacher with 150 kids a day, this is a little daunting. So I've seen some PLCs use a tracking chart like this just to track their watch kids, the kids that are that they're really um, working hard with. So in some cases, these could be my at-risk populations kids that I'm really targeting and focusing on to make sure that they're getting everything that they need. Again, you don't have to use a tracking chart. This is just an example of something that you could use and take a look at during the study phase. But the advantage of a tracking chart like this is you can kind of see the N means not mastered. All right, so if it's blank, it means they mastered it. If it's N, it means it's not mastered. I also know some teachers that use an AB for absent so that you can tell a difference between a not mastered and just a kid that was just absent. Um, and that helps a little bit too. But this is an interesting chart because you can kind of look down, especially if everybody adds all their data to the same chart. You can really kind of see um, um, if I look vertically down the chart, I can see by learning target. So let's just say these were the learning targets for this PLC cycle. I can really see what kids got and what kids didn't get in terms of the overall target. So, wow, they did great with the first 2 targets, really did pretty good up through the first 3 targets, but that 4th target really messed them up. So, why is that? Only half the kids got it. And then by the time we got to the next target, um, they were they were pretty good again. So what happened with that target? Was it an activity or a strategy that we used or didn't use? What could we do better? Do we need to make that a little bit longer? Do we just need to spend a little more time on that? Did we rush it? Maybe the activity that we used just didn't work and it wasn't good. So what do we need to do with that? So that's part of the conversations that you can have around that. Also, you can look at this chart obviously horizontally to look at trends with specific kids to make decisions about which kids are going to need um, small amounts of reteaching up to intensive levels of reteaching and or intervention. And so if I look at for example, Kinsey, the third student down, well, she missed 3 out of 5 targets. Why is that? Is that common for Kinsey? Is Kinsey always struggling and always have a hard time meeting targets the first time because she needs more reteaching? What can I continue to do for her? Or is this unusual for Kinsey? Because if this is unusual for Kinsey, then that's kind of a root cause piece. I've got to try to figure out what's going on there, right? And so you can kind of see trends with kids over time as well as trends with that. So that's another thing that you could do during the study phase. Another tool that some people like to pull in during the study phase is plus delta. Now, from an adult standpoint, what I recommend doing is keeping a plus delta chart for each cycle or each unit, really each unit. So as I get to the end of a unit and I get to my summative cycle, what I recommend that PLCs do during the study phase is take a look at the data and then list some plus deltas about the unit and keep these plus deltas for next year because you're going to be teaching the same stuff next year. And then you'll have a nice reference to go back to and say, oh, remember this went really well last time and we did this activity. So we need to remember that this activity worked really well with our kids because we made a note of it in the plus side. Delta means anything that you want to change or try to do differently. So on the delta side, that's where you want to record, oh, wait, the activity that we used for trace and author's argument did not go well because half the kids didn't get it. So on the delta side, I need to put something like, don't use blank activity for tracing an author's argument, need to add an extra day to that target, and need to change the activity and look for another activity for that target. So that's the kind of things that you would report on your plus delta. Then you've got record so that the next year when you go back in your planning phase for this particular unit, you go back, reflect on your plus deltas. It helps you remember things from your year. So I think that's a good idea. On the flip side of this, some people also use plus deltas and have the kids respond to those. So as you get towards the end of a unit, towards the summative cycle, it is really important to have kids reflect on individually what worked well for you, or you could do it collectively as a class, but ask the kids. In this particular unit, let's think back. We learned about X, Y, and Z. Here was our targets. Here was our standards that we've worked on. Here were the activities as a reminder. Talk to me or let me know what activities and strategies that we did that worked really well for you to help you learn this content. That way, I'll make sure in the future that I know that these work. And I also know what works well for you, what activities worked well for you specifically, so that I can incorporate more of those activities in the future for you as well as for future classes. And then you also ask students, what did you not like about this particular unit? Were there any strategies that just didn't work for you or that didn't help you learn or things that you would change? Like if I was going to teach this unit again to the students next year, what advice would you give me to make it better? And so it's really great to have that student input as you're designing and then just kind of hang on and reflect back on that. So this is not hard number data. This is more perception data from students, but it's very powerful. I think to study this type of data as well as the formative and summative assessment data as well. So those are some types of things that could happen during the study phase. Now, you don't do all of those things every single study phase. So what will happen is as you start doing more with study and data analysis, your PLC and or your school will determine the data collection method and the data discussion methods that work best for you, whether it be a sorting protocol like this, whether it be a tracking thing like this, whether it be some sort of spreadsheet that has percentages and things like that on it. All of those things are okay. You just have to kind of figure out what study pieces work the best for you. So ultimately, where I'm heading with this is I'm heading into the ACT phase because as a result of my study, and sometimes study and ACT sort of morph together because it's really hard to study the data without talking about what actions am I going to take as a result of that data, which is really what the ACT phase is. And so, what you're doing is kind of thinking about in study and ACT, you're thinking about what learning targets were student most successful on, what learning targets were they least successful on, and then narrowing that down to, for the target in which students were most successful, what strategies or activities did we use? And did those activities work with all students? Did they work with my gap or my at-risk students? On the flip side of that, when the students were least successful, what strategies or activities did we use? And did that impact all students, at-risk population students, whatever? So you're actually having conversations around those. And then finally, we're getting down to, so what changes do we need to consider for the next learning cycle? Are there any curricular changes that need to be made in the future? Do I need to change pacing guides? How am I going to reteach? What's my plan for reteaching? And so that's really what happens in the ACT phase. So again, study and ACT kind of go together. So I see it that plan and do go together and study and ACT go together. And so how you try to organize that, then your actions then start feeding into your plan, and then you just keep repeating the cycle. And it's just a never ending constant cycle of taking our data, developing our action plans, rolling that into my plan for the next cycle. So when you're planning, you're reflecting not only on what's coming ahead, but you're also reflecting back on the data that just happened during the prior cycle, and you're incorporating that into your plan for the next 2 weeks. So we have to move ahead into these new learning targets. But during the study phase, we also know that kids still don't really know how to trace an author's argument very well. So as I plan ahead for the next 2 week cycle, I need to incorporate not only the things that we're going to be working on during the next upcoming cycle, but I need to incorporate some revisiting of this trace and author's argument. Because they still don't have that, and I need to make sure that they know that. So as I'm planning ahead, what am I going to do to remediate that and reteach that to the kids that don't get it, as well as move forward into the new learning? And that's really kind of the plan, do, study, act cycle, and what that looks like. Now, if we reflect back on those 4 to 4 questions, I can think about, what do I want my students to know and be able to do? That's my plan phase. How am I going to know if they learn it? Well, really, what do I want my students to know and be able to do, and how are they going to learn it? That's my plan and do. How am I going to know if they learn it? What am I going to do if they get it? What am I going to do if they don't get it? So the plan, do, study, act, you can see, really encompasses very well all 4 questions of that PLC cycle, which is why PDSA is a really good structured model um, to do that. When plan, do, study, act is done well, what it does is it eliminates a lot of long-term misconceptions because I'm remediating along the way rather than waiting until the end of the unit to figure out that a kid doesn't get something. I know right away whether or not they got it, and I can remediate immediately with groups of students or individuals so that I can catch up as many kids as possible during the cycle rather than having to wait to the end of the cycle and then having to go back and reteach large amounts of information.